Good afternoon, good morning, good day, whatever time of the day it is, guys. We are talking about Edgar Allan Poe for the next 2 weeks. This week we're going to focus on some poetry. Next week we're going to focus on a short story. As you learned about Edgar Allan Poe, he was one strange guy. He was a great writer, great poet, great short story writer, and we are going to focus on one poem this week and a short story next week. He was considered one of America's first horror writers, and he writes some really horrific stuff. He was considered the father of the detective story. The story that we read next week is going to be an example of that. He was haunted. He had a very rough life, as you just learned from that video. His mother died when he was 2 years old. He didn't have a father in his life. He married his cousin, about as strange as it gets, and she died when she was very young, and that haunted him. A lot of his poetry, including the one that we're going to focus on this week, is about him being haunted by the loss of the people that he loved in his life. His most well-known poem is called The Raven, and that's one poem that some of you are going to be reading this week. He wrote another poem, also very well-known, called Annabel Lee. And I'm going to read the first stanza of each of those poems to you now and just explain a little bit about Poe in his writing style, especially when it came to poetry. Annabel Lee. This is a poem about a lost love of his, and the speaker in this poem loses someone named Annabel Lee. It was many and many a year ago in a kingdom by the sea that a maiden there lived whom you may know by the name of Annabel Lee. And this maiden she lived with no other thought than to love and be loved by me. So his rhyme is very evident. He goes on to talk about losing the love of his life, Annabel Lee. She dies in this poem, so a little spoiler alert. The rhyme is very obvious. He uses repetition a lot as well. He's going to repeat the phrase Annabel Lee quite a bit. He's going to repeat kingdom by the sea quite a bit. So repetition is one thing that Poe uses a lot, and alliteration is one thing that Poe uses a lot. Alliteration is when you use a word that begins with the same letter over and over again. I want you to listen for some repetition and for some alliteration in the first stanza of The Raven. This is probably his most well-known poem, and we're going to be reading that this week as well. The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary, over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, tapping at my chamber door. Only this and nothing more. So the repetition there, he says chamber door over and over. He says tapping and rapping over and over. And as this poem goes on, you will hear him repeat the same phrases over and over again. I want you to think about why does he repeat those same phrases? What's the purpose of that? And also he uses a lot of alliteration. In the first line, he says, while I pondered, weak and weary. Later he says, while I nodded, nearly napping. Later he says, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, tapping at my chamber door. Only this and nothing more. So sometimes when he rhymes, he just repeats the same phrase again. There's a reason he does that. Tomorrow, when you're reading Annabel Lee, or whether you're reading The Raven, somebody will be reading one, some will be reading another. You'll see why. Hopefully, you'll see and figure out why he uses the repetition and why he uses the alliteration as well, what the effect of it is. So this week, we're going to be focused on poetry. Next week, we're going to read something called The Telltale Heart, which, again, Poe wrote about horror. This Telltale Heart short story is about murder and the effect it has on human beings. So really cool stuff, pretty strange stuff. Hopefully you'll enjoy it as much as I did. Some of you may have read this stuff before. If you did, it's going to be fun to revisit it. If not, you'll learn something new. Talk to you tomorrow.